It was supposed to be just another ordinary day, one of those countless afternoons at LAX where travelers bustle between gates, minds preoccupied with their journeys. But life, as we often learn, has a way of revealing deep truths in the most unsuspecting places. For Evelyn Carter, a 75-year-old retired school teacher, this seemingly ordinary trip to visit her daughter would become a turning point. It wasn't just about getting through airport security or catching a flight. It was about dignity, respect, and what happens when someone who should have been invisible becomes the target of injustice. In a moment when she felt alone in the face of unnecessary scrutiny, Evelyn never imagined that someone with the power to change everything would step forward. That someone was Michael Jodan. The incident at the airport. As the afternoon wore on, the chaos of the terminal seemed to intensify. The air, thick with the tension of hundreds of rushed travelers, echoed with the hum of hurried footsteps and overhead announcements. Yet, in the middle of this frenzy, Evelyn Carter remained calm, an oasis of peace amidst the storm. Her heart fluttered with quiet anticipation. She was just a few steps away from boarding her flight to visit her daughter. It was something she had done countless times before, each trip marked by routine and comfort. But today, the routine would be shattered in a way she never expected. When Evelyn reached the TSA checkpoint, she was prepared for the usual. Remove the jacket, place her handbag on the conveyor belt, step through the scanner. It had always been straightforward for her, a woman who had spent years living with dignity and independence. She was a teacher, a mentor, someone who taught her students to stand tall, to carry themselves with grace and respect, no matter the circumstances. Yet, as she approached the body scanner, there was an unsettling stillness in her. The familiar beep of the scanner reverberated through the terminal, not in the usual way, but with an intensity that sent a shockwave through her chest. The young TSA agent barely looked up from her work as the machine beeped. "Step aside," the agent commanded, her voice cold, indifferent. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the first time she'd been pulled aside for additional screening, but this time it felt different. This time, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. As she complied, removing her shoes and scarf, the weight of the moment began to sink in. The stares from other travelers burned into her back. Some were impatient, frustrated that their line was moving slower. Others, uncomfortable, averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the uncomfortable reality unfolding in front of them. Evelyn had never been one to back down, but today she felt small, smaller than she ever had in all her years of teaching, of standing strong. She stepped through the scanner again, only to hear the dreaded beep once more. It was as if the world was echoing back her fears, confirming what she had already begun to suspect. She was being singled out, and for what? She had nothing to hide, nothing at all. But the agent's tone was sharp, dismissive as she ordered Evelyn to step aside once more. The implication was clear. Evelyn was now a suspect, her dignity reduced to nothing more than a mere inconvenience. As the agent began to pat her down, Evelyn's body stiffened. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the emotional blow she was receiving. The forcefulness of the agent's hands pressed against her arms, her back, her legs. It felt like more than just a security check. It felt like an accusation. "Do you have anything under your clothing?" the agent demanded. Evelyn's eyes widened, disbelief mixing with a simmering anger. "I have nothing to hide," she replied, her voice steady but strained. "You can check my bag." But her words were met with indifference. Her integrity, her history, her humanity, it all seemed irrelevant now. This wasn't just a search, it was a humiliation. And it was one that Evelyn never imagined she'd face at this point in her life, after all the lessons she had imparted to her students about standing up for what's right. How could it be that in her golden years she would be treated like this? How had she become invisible in the eyes of those who were meant to protect her? Mistreatment and humiliation. As Evelyn stood there, waiting for the next step in the endless process, she could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on her, suffocating her. The uncomfortable silence was broken only by the harsh rustle of the TSA agent's gloves and the soft murmur of the crowd around her. Evelyn, normally a woman who commanded respect with her calm demeanor and decades of wisdom, felt herself shrinking under the scrutiny. The other passengers, her peers in this moment, were like silent witnesses to her humiliation. Some avoided eye contact, as if pretending not to notice the older woman being treated with disdain. Others whispered, their impatience palpable, annoyed that the line was moving slower because of her. Evelyn had always believed that age brought dignity, that her years of experience as a teacher, the decades spent molding young minds, meant she deserved a certain level of respect in society. But here, at this very moment, she realized how fragile that respect could be when the world reduced you to a mere inconvenience. The physical discomfort of the pat-down was nothing compared to the emotional burden of being treated like a criminal without cause. Her pain, she had done nothing wrong. Yet she found herself standing there, humiliated, as the TSA agent's hands pressed firmly against her skin, her movements forceful and unyielding. The agent's questions were no more than perfunctory gestures, questions asked with the assumption that Evelyn had something to hide. "Do you have anything under your clothing?" she demanded sharply, her voice cold. The words stung more than the agent's touch. Evelyn straightened her back, trying to steady herself in the face of the unjust accusation. She had nothing to hide. Her body, worn with age but full of lived experience, was not a threat. But in this moment, it didn't matter. The assumption was made, and she was treated accordingly. The agent's harsh tone, her dismissive gestures, the quiet judgment in the eyes of other passengers, all of it coalesced into a gut-wrenching feeling of being invisible, less than, as if her worth had been reduced to a suspicion. "I have nothing to hide," Evelyn said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and sadness. It wasn't just the physical intrusion that had shaken her, it was the relentless assault on her dignity. She was a teacher. She had spent her life instilling in others the values of respect, integrity, and fairness. And yet here she was, on the receiving end of something far uglier than a simple security check. This was about something deeper, something far more painful. It was about being judged based on her appearance, on her age, on the assumptions that were made because she didn't fit a certain mold of who should be treated with dignity and respect. She felt small. Not physically, Evelyn was not a small woman, but emotionally. Her sense of self began to crumble as she was reduced to nothing more than a name on a list, an inconvenience to be managed. The agent's actions had stripped her of the power she once felt as a teacher, as a woman who had commanded respect for decades. The idea that she would be forced to prove her worth, to validate her very existence in front of strangers, was both disheartening and infuriating. And yet, despite the tears that threatened to rise in her eyes, Evelyn didn't break. She stood tall, though her shoulders felt heavy with the weight of the situation. She wasn't a criminal, she wasn't a suspect, but in this moment she felt as though she were being treated like one. The shame of being so unjustly targeted made her feel smaller than she had in years, smaller than she ever had in a classroom full of students who looked up to her for guidance and strength. In that instant, as she stood there, trying to hold herself together, Evelyn realized something. The humiliation wasn't just about her. It was about what this moment symbolized. It was a reminder of how easy it is to be overlooked when you don't fit the mold society expects of you. It was about how easily someone could be stripped of their dignity, their sense of self-worth, just because they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was a painful truth, one that Evelyn had never expected to face in her later years, but one that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Michael Jodan intervenes. Just as the situation seemed to reach its breaking point, something unexpected happened. A shift in the air, a sudden break in the tension that had held everyone captive. As the second TSA officer approached Evelyn, ready to usher her away for a more invasive, humiliating search, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the thick atmosphere like a knife. "Why are you treating her like that?" For a moment, time seemed to stop. The words hung in the air, a challenge, an accusation. The entire area grew silent, the buzzing of the terminal fading into the background as heads turned toward the source of the voice. Standing a few feet away, calm but unmistakable in his presence, was a man whose mere identity carried weight. Michael Jodan. He stood there in a simple black t-shirt, his baseball cap pulled low, blending in like any other traveler at first glance. But as he slowly removed the cap, The collective gasp from the crowd confirmed what his quiet confidence had already signaled. This was no ordinary passenger. This was a figure whose legacy spoke volumes. A person who had, over decades, become synonymous with strength, fairness, and unyielding integrity. The energy in the terminal shifted. The passengers, who had earlier been either too uncomfortable or too indifferent to intervene, now felt a spark of solidarity. Their gazes moved from Evelyn, the woman being treated with disdain, to Michael Jodan, the symbol of justice they needed in this moment. Evelyn turned toward him, her eyes wide in disbelief. For a moment, she wasn't sure if she was imagining it. Was someone really standing up for her? Was someone really calling out the injustice she had endured silently? The TSA agents, once so sure of their authority, now seemed to falter. The supervisor's posture stiffened as he recognized who had spoken, his previous defiance now replaced by uncertainty. "This is none of your concern, sir," the supervisor said, but his words lacked conviction, the sharpness from before slipping away. Michael Jordan's gaze remained steady, unwavering. "It is my concern when I see an elderly woman being humiliated for no reason." The words were simple, but they were enough. They carried the weight of truth, the power of witnessing something wrong and choosing to stand against it. The entire scene had shifted. No longer was Evelyn isolated in her humiliation. She was now surrounded by the silent support of bystanders who had witnessed the injustice and were now waiting, holding their collective breath, to see what would unfold. The TSA agent, once confident in her actions, looked down at the floor, her shoulders tense with the pressure of being scrutinized by someone who commanded respect in a way she never would. Michael Jordan's words had opened a space for reflection, for accountability. His calm, commanding presence made it clear that this wasn't just about a woman going through airport security. This was about something far deeper, the way power is wielded, the way people are treated, and how easily dignity can be stripped away when no one steps in to defend what's right. His intervention wasn't just about him being Michael Jordan. It was about standing up for justice, about reminding everyone in that room that what was happening to Evelyn was wrong and that it mattered. For Evelyn, this was more than just a famous figure stepping into her defense. It was a moment of empowerment, of realization that she wasn't alone. For years, she had taught her students to advocate for the truth, to stand up when something wasn't right. But here, she had been forced into a situation where she needed someone else to speak up for her, to defend her against an injustice that seemed as though it would go unnoticed. And when Michael Jordan did just that, it felt as if the world had shifted. Her eyes locked with his, a silent thank you passing between them. It wasn't just the celebrity that had caught her attention, but the essence of what he represented. The willingness to use one's influence for the greater good, to bring attention to what was right in the face of overwhelming indifference. Michael Jordan didn't need to be there. He could have walked away minding his own business, but he didn't. And he chose, in that moment, to make a stand, not because of who he was, but because of what was at stake. And so, as the tension grew thicker, as the agent hesitated and the supervisor fumbled for an answer, the power dynamic had shifted. Evelyn, once the target of judgment and suspicion, was no longer alone. She had been given a voice, and with it the courage to hold her head a little higher in the face of injustice. Resolution and apology. The moment of silence that followed Michael Jordan's intervention felt like the calm before a storm. The TSA agents, once confident in their handling of the situation, now stood uneasily, caught under the weight of the scrutiny that had been so suddenly thrust upon them. The crowd, which had previously been hesitant to engage, now seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the resolution that would either restore justice or solidify the injustice they had just witnessed. Evelyn, still standing tall, felt the world shift around her. She wasn't just standing in an airport anymore. She was standing in the face of something much larger. A system that had failed her, an institution that had allowed her to be treated as less than simply because of her age and appearance. The humiliation that had come in waves was starting to fade, replaced by a complex mix of emotions, disbelief, anger, but also something else, something she hadn't expected. It was a quiet sense of power, a sense that for the first time in a long while, her voice mattered, her worth mattered, and the world wasn't going to let her be invisible anymore. Michael Jordan stood there, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the TSA supervisor. There was no threat in his posture, no outward display of anger, but there was something in his calm intensity that made it impossible for anyone to ignore the injustice unfolding before them. The supervisor, unable to maintain his earlier bravado, shifted from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the collective gaze. "I think we should just let her go," the TSA agent muttered, her voice small, almost apologetic, but not enough to erase the damage already done. She couldn't meet Evelyn's eyes. There was no real apology in her words, just an attempt to move on, to sweep the situation under the rug. But Evelyn could feel the weight of the agent's discomfort. She could feel the undercurrent of regret, though it was muted, hollow. The apology wasn't real. It wasn't sincere. It was the kind of apology that came when you knew you had been caught doing something wrong, but weren't ready to fully admit the harm you'd caused. The supervisor's face flushed with embarrassment, the realization of his failure settling like a heavy burden on his shoulders. He wanted to be done with this, to pretend it hadn't happened, to move on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Evelyn, the woman they had so callously ignored, was no longer the object of their judgment. She was a person, a dignified, respected individual who had been wronged, and they all knew it. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a begrudging sigh. "Ma'am, you're free to go," he said, his tone flat, devoid of any genuine remorse. His eyes flickered to the growing crowd, the phones now recording every moment, the collective energy of dozens of strangers watching him in quiet judgment. The words he had spoken should have been an apology, but instead they felt like a dismissal. A transaction, a way to simply end the situation without addressing the real issue at hand. But Evelyn wasn't fooled. She had been teaching for decades, had witnessed countless moments where people said one thing but meant another. She knew when words lacked sincerity. She knew when an apology was just a way to placate someone without truly acknowledging the harm done. The supervisor's half-hearted words stung, but they didn't sting nearly as much as the forceful pat-down, the dismissive attitude, the implication that her life and dignity didn't matter. Her gaze didn't soften. She didn't smile in gratitude. Instead, Evelyn held his gaze with quiet resolve, her eyes steady and unwavering. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without it meaning something. She had spent her entire life teaching the importance of integrity, of standing up for what was right, even when no one was watching. But now, standing here, she realized the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. Her voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of her experience, the weight of every child she had taught over the years, and every life she had impacted through her lessons of respect and fairness. "I appreciate that," she said simply, her words devoid of emotion but full of meaning. She didn't need to hear the apology, in the way the supervisor had intended it. She didn't need his insincere words. What she needed, what the world needed, was the recognition that this moment had shaken something deeper in the very fabric of justice and human dignity. And in that quiet moment, she knew she had won something much more significant than any half-hearted apology could provide. Michael Jordan's steady gaze, which had never wavered, softened as he turned toward Evelyn. "Are you good?" he asked, his voice calm, the weight of everything hanging in the air between them. Evelyn took a breath. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding in. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness. Somehow, all of it seemed to leave her in one exhale. She wasn't sure if it was because of the apology she had received, or because of the silent validation she had just been given by a stranger who didn't owe her anything but still chose to stand for what was right. "I am now," she said, her voice steady, but there was something else in it now. A quiet relief, a sense that her worth had not been completely lost in the chaos of that moment. She had stood her ground, had faced injustice head-on, and in the end, she had emerged with her dignity intact. The journey she had begun that day, one of humiliation, of being made to feel small, had come full circle. She wasn't small anymore. She wasn't invisible. The shift in power. As the TSA supervisor reluctantly issued his half-hearted apology and the crowd shifted uncomfortably, something quietly shifted in the air. It was as if the oppressive tension that had settled in the terminal for what felt like hours suddenly began to dissipate. But it wasn't just the apology that created this change. It was the realization, the quiet, undeniable truth, That Evelyn, once a figure standing alone against an unjust system, was no longer powerless. In the blink of an eye, she had transformed from a silent victim of institutionalized judgment to a symbol of quiet strength, of resilience that had somehow stirred the conscience of the crowd around her. The truth was undeniable now. Michael Jodan, in his unassuming yet commanding way, had intervened, not just to stop the TSA from taking further action against Evelyn, but to expose the fragile nature of the power they had wielded over her. With every word he spoke, the illusion of control that the TSA agents had so carefully maintained began to crumble. Their once confident authority, built on the assumption that their decisions were unquestionable, now felt flimsy and unsure. The truth had been laid bare, and it was impossible to ignore. The crowd, which had stood in silence, uncertain of how to act or what to say, now seemed to collectively awaken. The phones that had previously been raised to capture the moment were now more than just tools for documenting. They were symbols of the power of visibility, of holding people accountable in real time. What had begun as an uncomfortable, almost dismissive situation had now become a scene that transcended the walls of the airport. People had witnessed injustice, and now they were watching it being corrected. The crowd's energy shifted. No longer passive observers, they had become participants in something larger, something meaningful. For Evelyn, the change was profound. It was as if she had stepped out from under a heavy weight. The invisible burden of age, race, and societal assumptions suddenly lifted. She no longer felt like a suspect, a threat, or a problem to be dealt with. For the first time in hours, she felt the validation of her existence. She wasn't invisible anymore. The entire scene that had unfolded, one where she had been humiliated and made to feel like she didn't belong, had, in the end, reversed. It was a quiet victory, one that wasn't about the apology or the superficial resolution offered by the TSA agents, but about reclaiming her power in that moment. The power dynamic had shifted. Evelyn, though still standing in the same spot, had moved from being a passive recipient of treatment to a powerful force who had been seen, heard, and respected. Her very presence, her refusal to back down, had caused the TSA agents to reconsider their actions, and in doing so, she had become more than just a passenger going through security. She had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that sometimes all it takes is for one person to stand up for what's right in the face of overwhelming odds. And then there was the crowd. The passengers who had once avoided eye contact, who had whispered in impatience, were now watching with something else in their eyes. An understanding that what had just happened wasn't a minor inconvenience. It wasn't simply a woman being inconvenienced at an airport. It was about the way people are treated. It was about justice. It was about dignity. It was about remembering that no one, no matter their age, background, or appearance, should be subjected to the indignities that Evelyn had faced. The phones that had once been aimed at the agents, recording the moment, were now trained on Evelyn as she stood in quiet, victorious strength. The applause that slowly began to echo in the terminal wasn't loud at first. It was almost hesitant. Just a few claps, unsure, like the audience wasn't quite sure if they were allowed to acknowledge the moment. But soon, the quiet claps turned into something more resounding, more powerful. It wasn't just about Evelyn's moment of vindication. It was a collective recognition that they had all witnessed something wrong being set right. It was the collective recognition of the power of standing up for what was just, of speaking out when you see something wrong. Evelyn, standing tall, felt the weight of those claps in a way she hadn't expected. She had felt small before, invisible even, but now she felt seen. She felt heard. It wasn't about the apology she had received, nor about the fleeting attention from Michael Jodan, though both had been powerful. It was about the shift that had occurred within her. She realized that in that moment, she had reminded the world that justice, dignity, and respect for all people, regardless of age, race, or background, were not negotiable. And when people came together, when they allowed themselves to see and to speak up, the tide could be turned. As Evelyn turned to walk away, still holding her belongings in her hands, she could feel the weight of the world in her chest begin to lighten. She wasn't just a 75-year-old woman traveling to visit her daughter anymore. She was a woman who had faced injustice head-on and had changed the course of her own narrative. She had reminded everyone around her that sometimes one voice was all it took to shift the world, to make others realize that justice and dignity weren't privileges to be given, but rights to be upheld. And as the applause slowly died down, Evelyn knew that this was a moment she would never forget. It wasn't about the TSA, it wasn't about the airport. It was about the deep, resonating shift in the hearts of those who had witnessed it, and that change, that recognition, would echo far beyond the confines of that terminal. Final words in conversation with Michael Jordan. As the TSA supervisor reluctantly delivered his half-hearted apology, and the tension in the air began to ease, something quietly shifted within Evelyn. She stood there, her back straight, her hands still holding on to the remnants of what had been her dignity, a dignity that had, until moments ago, been stripped away by unnecessary humiliation. But now, there was something else in the air. It was a profound sense of closure, of something broken being mended, but also an understanding that this moment had been more than just about her. This was about what she had been reminded of in the face of injustice. Evelyn's gaze shifted toward Michael Jordan, the man who had stood up for her when no one else did, who had stepped into the spotlight not just for his own sense of justice, but for a woman who had never expected to find herself in such a position. The quiet power he exuded was something she could never have expected. It wasn't the glitzy celebrity presence she had seen in the tabloids or on the screen. It was a human presence, steady, grounded, unwavering in the face of wrong. And in that moment she felt the profound weight of his words, even as he spoke them with calm authority. "Are you good?" Michael Jordan's voice was quiet, but it carried a depth of meaning that Evelyn had never expected to hear. It wasn't just a question of her well-being. It was a question that acknowledged the weight of the moment, the weight of everything she had just endured, and the victory that had unfolded. For a brief moment, Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. She hadn't realized how much of herself she had kept in check, how much of the anger and hurt from the humiliation still weighed on her. But standing there, not just with Michael Jordan, but with the weight of everything that had transpired, she realized something fundamental. This was more than just an apology she had received, more than just the validation of standing up for herself. This was about something bigger. The larger narrative of how people treat one another, how systems of power function, and how justice is sometimes met with an unexpected hero. "I am now," she replied, her voice steady but her words carrying the depth of what she had been through. It wasn't just about a simple resolution, it was about the restoration of her sense of self, the reaffirmation of her worth in the face of an entire system that tried to convince her otherwise. And yet, even as she stood there accepting the outcome, she knew that she wasn't the only one who had been changed. This moment, though focused on her, had become something far more profound than a single act of kindness. Michael Jordan's expression softened, though his gaze remained intense. He nodded, as if understanding the quiet transformation Evelyn had just undergone. His actions had been simple. A few words, a quiet confrontation, a moment of standing in solidarity. But the impact of those moments rippled through the airport, through the crowd, and into the very heart of what it meant to stand for justice. "You didn't need me," Michael Jordan continued, his voice calm but firm. "You already had the strength," he added, looking at Evelyn with a soft, almost knowing look. "You just needed someone to remind them." Evelyn blinked, as if the truth of his words had only just settled. It wasn't about the grand gestures, the famous figure standing up for her. It was about her own strength, the strength she had carried with her all her life, even when it felt like the world had turned its back on her. It was about the resilience of a woman who had dedicated her life to teaching, to standing up for truth and justice, and realizing in this very moment that her voice, even in the face of adversity, was just as powerful as anyone's. She hadn't lost that strength. She had only needed the reminder. "Thank you," she said softly, the words coming from a place deeper than simple gratitude. It was a thank you for the reminder of what was possible, a thank you for standing with her when it felt like she was standing alone. And in that simple exchange, something had shifted. Evelyn had been reminded of her own power, her own ability to demand justice, even when the world was trying to convince her otherwise. Michael Jordan, with a small nod, took a step back, turning toward his own security lane. But the impact of his presence would not be forgotten. As he walked away, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a quiet gratitude for the moment, for the knowledge that sometimes all it takes is one person, one small act of courage, to remind us of the larger truths we sometimes forget in the struggle for survival. The crowd, still silent, began to stir as the moment lingered in the air, capturing the essence of what had just unfolded. The phones continued to record, but this time they weren't just capturing a story. They were capturing a moment of collective awakening, of seeing what was wrong and taking action to right it. Evelyn gathered her belongings, her heart lighter than it had been just moments before. As she walked toward her gate, she felt different, stronger, seen, heard. And as she passed the throngs of people who had witnessed everything, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugged at her lips. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had been seen, not just by Michael Jodan, but by everyone who had watched, who had stood in the face of injustice and waited for it to be called out. And that moment, that quiet victory, would stay with her long after the airport faded into the background, a reminder that the fight for dignity, respect, and justice was never over, and that, sometimes, all it takes is one person to remind us that we all have the strength to make a difference. Conclusion and call to action. As Evelyn slowly walked away from the security checkpoint, her feet carried her with a lightness she hadn't felt in hours. The weight that had settled on her chest, the shame and confusion that had flooded her mind, was beginning to dissipate. It wasn't because the TSA had apologized, or even because the situation had resolved in her favor. It was because something deeper had occurred, something that transcended the moment. Evelyn had not only regained her dignity, but she had also reminded the world of a powerful truth. Dignity, respect, and justice should never be negotiable. No one should have to prove their worth, especially when they've done nothing wrong. The crowd, still silent, had borne witness to something profound. The applause, though small and hesitant at first, had gradually grown, each clap an acknowledgement that the injustice they had all just seen would not go unnoticed. There was something deeply human in that moment. A collective realization that the world had witnessed the breakdown of a system that too often allowed people to be treated as lesser, simply because they did not fit certain molds. It was a moment when power dynamics shifted, when those who had previously turned a blind eye were suddenly aware of the gravity of what had transpired. As Evelyn reached her gate, the last remnants of the moment began to settle in her heart. She wasn't just a woman traveling to see her daughter anymore. She was a symbol of quiet strength, resilience, and the unyielding belief that justice should never be contingent on age, race, or appearance. It wasn't the TSA supervisor's apology that made her feel whole again. It was the collective action of bystanders who had witnessed the injustice and decided in that moment that it was wrong. And it was Michael Jordan's simple but powerful intervention that had made it all possible. His presence reminded her that sometimes the greatest heroes aren't those who make grand gestures, but those who stand up in the quietest of moments to say, "This is wrong." She picked up her boarding pass and her belongings, feeling the weight of the situation slowly lift from her shoulders. But there was still a sense of unease, a sense of unfinished business. The passengers who had stood by, silent witnesses to the injustice, had watched a powerful truth unfold before their eyes. But they had also seen a critical reminder. The fight for justice doesn't end when the cameras are off, when the applause dies down. It doesn't end when the situation is over. It lives on in the conversations we have, in the choices we make when we see injustice in the world around us. In that moment, Evelyn knew something that would stay with her long after she left the airport. The true power of justice lies not in grand speeches or public gestures, but in the quiet, resolute actions of those who refuse to stand idly by when they see something wrong. Michael Jodan had been a catalyst for change, yes, but the true power had always been Evelyn's. It had always been the power of one individual to stand up against injustice, to not let themselves be silenced, even when the world seemed to conspire against them. Now, as she reflected on what had transpired, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a deep sense of hope. The world wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was moments like these, moments when someone spoke out, when someone stood up for what was right, that made her believe that change was always possible. Change didn't always come with loud speeches or grand protests. Sometimes it came in the form of quiet actions, of standing firm in the face of adversity, of refusing to accept anything less than dignity. And so, Evelyn smiled to herself as she boarded her flight. It wasn't a smile born from relief alone. It was a smile born from something deeper. It was a smile born from the understanding that the struggle for justice, for fairness, and for dignity was never over. It was a smile born from the knowledge that every small act of courage, every decision to stand up for what's right, ripples out into the world, creating change in ways we may never fully understand. As you watch this story, I ask you to reflect on your own moments of standing up for what's right. Have you ever been in a situation where you had the chance to speak out, to be the one who made the difference? It doesn't take a hero to change the world. It just takes a person who is willing to act when they see injustice. Whether it's standing up for someone who is being treated unfairly, challenging a system that needs reform, or simply supporting someone in a difficult moment, every action matters. I encourage you to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you experienced a time when someone stood up for you, or when you were the one who made a stand? Your story could inspire others to take action, to make a difference in the world around them. Don't forget to subscribe and join our community, where we continue to explore the importance of justice, dignity, and the power of standing up for what's right. Together, we can all create a world where every voice is heard, every life is respected, and justice is something we all have the strength to achieve. Let's stand together, not just when the cameras are rolling, but every day when it matters most.